It's all right, Jordan. We all have rough nights sometimes. I'm setting myself up right now by making that comment. We're going to be in Joshua chapter 5 and chapter 6, and a little bit of chapter 7 tonight. Another one of those lessons that comes from our Wednesday night study. So we just actually talked about this a week or two ago on Wednesday, and the story of the conquest, how Joshua took the place of Moses and took over the leadership role as Israel was going to displace the Canaanites out of the land and take it for themselves. So I'm going to make just a few applications and read through the text, starting at the latter part of Joshua chapter 5. Now I'd like to make just a brief comment before we look at the text for the evening. And just a reminder, they don't happen that often, but on a 5-Sunday month, we like the evening if anybody wants the opportunity to prepare and present a sermon, a lesson from the Bible. We sort of keep this time slot reserved for that. So see myself or one of the elders, I think there's maybe 2 more left in the year, 1 or 2 more left, but come see me if you'd like an opportunity to preach. And, we'd like to keep that open. And another note on the evening lessons I prepare, I really like to take this time especially to address questions, and in times past we've had question box out back, but physical question box. But by all means, if there's something you'd like to hear me address and prepare some thoughts on, or a question you've had about the Bible that you'd like to get my feedback on, by all means, email me or come talk to me or write down a little note with a question on it. And that's really the kind of material I like to work towards on the evening lesson. So just be thinking about that. If there's anything you jotted down as a note, I want to look that up more, or I want to talk some about that, submit it as a suggestion or a question, and I'll come back to that one of these Sunday evenings and give you some of my thoughts from the Bible on it. So that being said, we're in Joshua chapter 5, first of all, and we're going to start in verse 13. So what's happened up to this point, and we've actually done a few sermons in this text recently too, as we looked earlier in chapter 4, if you recall, that's when they cross over the Jordan on dry ground. And so it's very symbolic that as they departed Egypt, the place of their slavery, they walked across the Red Sea on the dry ground. And so it's very symbolic, very important reminder to them of God's power that they walk across the Jordan River on dry ground into the promised land. This is the first time after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. This is now the first time that they actually have set foot. A generation has passed away and 40 years' time has gone. And God has been put to the test countless times. And so now we're going to see if they will put their faith and trust in God as they are prepared to enter this land. And as they cross through, they bring the Ark of the Covenant through the waters, and they set up 12 stones as a memorial, one from each tribe. One man from each tribe is selected to represent the tribe and place a stone on this memorial. And so as to serve as a reminder to them and for future generations to look at those stones and remember how God had been so good to them and how God had helped them continually. Now, a little bit earlier, if you go back to about chapter 2, we're introduced to Rahab in the city of Jericho, and it's a little bit different story, and we'll reference her a little bit. That's a great story there about faith, though, about Rahab. And so we've already had our introduction. We know Jericho is a very strong and fortified city. They've already spied it out, and so they know the lay of the land. They know that really, if they do the math, they realize we're not strong enough. We don't have the manpower, we don't have the firepower to really go in a siege against a well-fortified city. And spied it out, but nevertheless, they follow God's word, and they're going to trust him on this. And so here we find, now that's a little bit of the context, so here we find in Joshua chapter 5, kind of this interesting story here. We find in Joshua kind of scoping the terrain a little bit on his own, it would seem. At least when I read it, it sounds like Joshua is maybe alone with his thoughts and just thinking, how are we going to do this? So in chapter 5 and verse 13, it says, "Now it came about when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing opposite with a sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, Are you for us or for our adversaries? And he said, No, rather, I indeed come now as captain of the host of the Lord. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, "What is my Lord to say to his servant?" And the captain of the Lord's host said to Joshua, "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." And so we start with a reminder of who is in control. We start with a reminder of where their strength lies, and that is in their Lord. That is in Jehovah, who led them out of Egypt, who fed them and took care of them in the wilderness. He is the one that will go before them. And so this is symbolic in a sense, but I think it's also a very literal description of what happened. But in some ways, it's symbolic of showing that God is ready for the fight. He sees a man with a sword already drawn in his hand, prepared for battle. And of course, his natural reaction is, are you for us or against us? Who are you? But it's revealed that he represents the Lord. Other translations make it sound like this might be an actual appearance of the Lord as he did from time to time, or the reference to the angel of the Lord. But that's another question for perhaps another Sunday evening. We'll talk about that. But in Joshua, I love his reaction. He fell on his face to the earth and bowed down. If we're going to win the victories in our life, and what we find here in Joshua chapter 5, 6, 7 is the blueprint for overcoming our battles, for winning our fights spiritually. This is our blueprint today. And so what I love here is this idea of being humble and falling down at the right feet. It's acknowledging who has the strength. And so we too need to understand, I don't have the strength to win this fight. I don't have the strength to overcome temptation. I don't have the strength to be holy and righteous and good. And Paul says that in the book of Romans chapter 3. There's none who is good. There's not one who is good. We don't have the strength to do that on our own. And so we need to acknowledge this. Can you relate to Joshua here? Have you ever been in that situation where you've inherited a great amount of responsibility from someone you looked up to and said, they know what they're doing. This person always had all the answers. That's Joshua. For over 40 years, he had been a servant and attendant of Moses. He had been a servant to Moses since his youth. So as a young man, he looked up to Moses, was very protective of him. We recall the story where I believe the two guys' names were Eldad and Medad. They were given a portion of the Spirit. There were other elders who were going to help Moses, but these two guys were outside of the group. And you see them prophesying because the Spirit fell upon them. And Joshua gets jealous. Moses, you need to tell them to stop. And Moses said, no, I wish everyone was a prophet. I wish everyone. I wish it was all spread out. I don't want all of it for myself. But we see that he looked up to and admired Moses greatly. And now Moses is gone. And I would imagine he's wondering, can I live up to and fill the shoes of Moses? Or sandals, I should say. Can I carry on the mantle? Can I do the work that he did? Can I show the competence? Can I be the kind of leader that he was? And so here he is. What do you think his strategy was at this point, by the way? I have a suspicion that he's alone by himself because he's waiting for God to reveal it to him. He's there scoping out the terrain by himself, looking at the battle that lays ahead of him and knowing it's on his shoulders now Moses is gone. And so I really admire his humility here. If you ever feel overwhelmed, if you ever feel like how could I possibly measure up to this person I look up to, or the generation who's gone before us, or other great people, if you ever inherited some great responsibilities, or if you're ever facing a great struggle in your life, you're facing sin and temptation, we need to remember to fall at the right feet and follow the example of Joshua. He didn't have an easy task to come and step in place of Moses and fill his position as leader in Israel. But when God appeared, when God said, I am ready to fight, he fell down. And we've heard this language before. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. It's very reminiscent of Moses in Exodus chapter 3, when he sees the burning bush in the wilderness. This is God speaking. And so we need to acknowledge that without God, we're hopeless. And so this is really the start of this story, but we need to move into chapter 6 and understand that step 2 in this process, this blueprint for victory, it's acknowledging who is in control, who has the power, who has the strength, and being humble enough to follow God, seeking him in prayer and looking to him for the answers. But when he gives us the answer, we need to follow it even though it might not always make sense. We're going to read a pretty good chunk of the text now, starting in chapter 6. He has this vision where this man, this soldier with a sword drawn, says, I represent the host of the Lord of armies, and I'm ready to lead the fight. And so here's the battle strategy. Chapter 6 and verse 1. Now Jericho was tightly shut because of the sons of Israel. No one went out and no one came in. Okay, people had heard things over the last 40 years. Israel had won a few battles where they were greatly outnumbered, including embarrassing Pharaoh in Egypt 40 years ago. That's something nobody got away with. They had heard stories. They were probably a little bit afraid, but also they knew they were the stronger of the two. Nonetheless, they were tightly shut because of the sons of Israel. Verse 2, and the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have given Jericho into your hand, with its king and the valiant warriors. Now, do we believe that? Would you believe that if you were in the place of Joshua? Here you go, Joshua. It's yours. You've already won. I've already sealed your victory. Do we believe that when he tells us we are more than conquerors? We overwhelmingly conquer through the blood of his Son. Do we believe that the victory is ours? Or do we look around the world and feel like we're so outnumbered? This battle is lost. It's hopeless. No, God has promised us the victory. And so we need to follow his plan. But here's his plan, and it doesn't make sense. He says in verse 3, you shall march around the city, all the men of war, circling the city once. You shall do so for 6 days. Also, 7 priests shall carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. Then on the 7th day, you shall march around the city 7 times. And the priests shall blow the trumpets, and it shall be that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, and all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people will go up every man straight ahead. So Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said to them, take up the ark covenant, and let 7 priests carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord. Then he said to the people, go forward and march around the city, and let the armed men go on before the ark of the Lord. And it was so that when Joshua had spoken to the people, 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord went forward and blew the trumpets. And the ark of the covenant of the Lord followed them. And the armed men went before the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard came after the ark. Well, they continued to blow the trumpets. But Joshua commanded the people, saying, you shall not shout, nor let your voice be heard, nor let a word proceed out of your mouth until the day I tell you, shout. Then you shall shout. So he had the ark of the Lord taken around the city, circling it once. Then they came into the camp and spent the night in the camp. And so we'll just stop for a moment there. And how important was it for them to observe all the details of God's commands? Why wasn't Moses there? That's a question to ponder. Because he shouted at the wrong time. And because he struck the rock. Because he didn't follow the right instruction. He shouted and struck the rock, and so to draw the water forth. And it might seem like a minor infraction. That's God's way of saying, look, when I give straightforward and clear, unmistakable commands, there's no excuse for not following them as I've given them. And so they take careful instruction. That's probably why Joshua is extra cautious, saying, look, don't raise your voice. Don't make a sound until I tell you to. This is all we're doing. And so does this plan make any sense at all? I mean, of course not. And in verse 12, now Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord, and the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord went on continually, and blew the trumpets, and the armed men went before them, and the rear guard came after the ark of the Lord, while they continued to blow the trumpets. Thus the 2nd day they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did so for 6 days. They're showing off their full force, which again, compared to Jericho, is probably laughable. That's not a really good battle strategy. You don't want to show, you don't want to put all your cards on the table. You don't want everyone to know what your full strength is. You want them to think you're the stronger of the two, but here they are just walking for 6 days in a row. Not a really good strategy. And then on the 7th day, it says, in verse 15, They rose early at the dawning of the day and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. Only on that day they marched around the city 7 times, just like God had said. And it came at the seventh time, when the priest blew the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. And the city shall be under the ban, and all that is in it that belongs to the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot and all who are with her in the house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent." And so we have to admire their faith here. There's a lot of faith in these couple of verses. They have a plan that doesn't make any sense, yet they understand who God is. Finally, after 40 years, they understand that God is strength. They understand that God is wise beyond their comprehension. They understand that when you follow and obey God, good things are the result. When you do things one way, bad things are the result. They finally understood the whole concept of the law in the book of Deuteronomy, as Moses told them. Choose this day. Will you choose a path of blessing, or will you choose a path of curses? Choose. It's very simple. Will you follow God, or will you reject him? They have very different outcomes, whichever path you choose. And so they have the faith to do it, even though it doesn't make sense. And so we read the Bible. Hopefully we all do. And we listen to what God tells us to do in our lives. And sometimes it doesn't make sense. Sometimes God asks us to do things that are difficult, that are not easy. Sometimes God asks us to confront very close loved ones, very dear friends, to confront them and rebuke them for their sins. Sometimes God calls us to forgive people, even though our feeling is to not, even though our feeling is to hold it against them. He calls us to do very difficult things. He calls us to not pursue riches and wealth in this world. He calls us to be generous, to give until it hurts. From a worldly or human standpoint, what God asks of us, that plan doesn't always make sense. A lot of people want to look to the Bible as if it's the guide for a happy and fulfilled life, the way to make all your friends like you. But Jesus said, no, if you follow me, people are probably going to hate you for it. And you're going to be abused, mistreated for it, or ridiculed. That doesn't always make sense, does it? But God says, trust me on this. Please trust me. I promise I have such good things for you. I have such good rewards in store for you if you just follow me. I know you might not understand it. It might not make sense. You might not see how this works out for your good. But if we trust him, his plans work. And so we follow the right plan no matter if it makes sense to us or not, no matter if it feels like what we want to do or not, because we have faith in God. And on that idea of faith, Rahab, she was spared. You got to put yourself in her shoes. She's an incredible example of faith. If you're just going to look at this situation from a worldly standpoint, she's on the winning team. And she's helping the losing team out. From a worldly standpoint, there's no reason why this group of wandering vagrants in the desert without any horses and chariots, there's no good reason why they should come right up to the walls of Jericho, knock them down, and conquer the city. There's no explanation for why that should have happened apart from God. So she's helping the people out that really are going to lose. And what if she got caught doing that? But she has faith in God. She understands. She didn't grow up, one of those children in the wilderness. She didn't grow up hearing the law recited every year, the law that was given through Moses just 40 years earlier. Yeah, she was smart enough to acknowledge there's one God in this world. There's one creator of everything, and I can tell he's with these people. So I will take my side with them. So we have great examples of faith, and that just reminds us that the Bible is going to challenge you. I promise you that. If you're going to do what God wants you to do in your life, it is going to challenge you. God is going to want you to do things that you are not going to want to do. He is going to point you in directions that don't make any sense to you at times, but that's where we've got to fiercely hold on in our faith and say, I'll put aside my logic. This makes sense because God said so, and God is the creator of everything, and God knows what is best for me. I don't. So we need to follow the right plan, regardless of whether it makes sense. And one final thought here. We need to finish the plan. more than just a halfway effort or most of the way effort. It's sad to see those who give a lot but not enough. It's sad to see those who will go 9/10 of the way with Jesus and then stop carrying the cross and up having gone so far. See this thing through to the end. His plan, what we read about in the Bible, it's not going to lead you to wealth and fame and popularity. But stick with it. It's going to lead to something much better. They were told to not keep anything for themselves. In verse 17, the city shall be under the ban, and all that is in it belongs to the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot and all who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. But as for you, only keep yourselves from the things under the ban, lest you covet them, take some of the things under the ban, so you would make the camp of Israel accursed and bring trouble on it. That's a prophetic verse right there, as we're going to read a little bit into the next chapter. But all the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron are holy to the Lord. They shall go into the treasury of the Lord. So the people shouted, and priests blew the trumpets, and it came about when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout. The wall fell down flat, so the people went up into the city, every man straight ahead, and they took the city. And they utterly destroyed everything in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and ox and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword. And Joshua said to the two men who had spied out the land, go into the harlot's house and bring the one woman and all she has out of there, as you have sworn to her. And so they go and rescue Rahab and spare her. God wanted them to carry out this plan to its fullest conclusion. I'm going to give you the city. My plan of just walking around it a bunch of times is going to work. The city's going to fall. You're going to go in, burn it, destroy it, get rid of everything, kill every last person, and no reason for that. A lot of people question God in the Old Testament especially, but that again is maybe one of those lessons for another time, why God allowed Israel to, dispossess people from their land and kill so many people in battle, but we'll discuss that another time. The main point here, they would be a bad influence on Israel. They were wicked people. The inhabitants of Canaan, they put their children through the fire as offerings to their god Molech. They practiced various forms of prostitution as worship and gave their children away to become prophets in temples. God didn't want any of that wickedness, that godlessness affecting his people. So he told them, get rid of everything. Destroy every last thing. You need to carry this out all the way. Obey my commands fully. Remember, that's the difference between Saul and David. Saul was a good king, but not a great king. He was a good person, but not a righteous person, because he didn't obey all of the Lord's commands. And that's why God chose David to replace him. We need to finish the plan, not just do it until it's convenient, and then when it's inconvenient, we need to carry out God's commands and stick with it. Because we go into the next chapter and we find out what a little bit of sin in the camp can do. And I won't dwell too much on this because that's another sermon we did a month or two back. But it says in chapter 7, but the sons of Israel acted unfaithfully in regard to the things under the ban. For Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, the son of Zerah from the tribe of Judah, took some of the things under the ban. Therefore the anger of the Lord burned against the sons of Israel. He probably thought, I'm not hurting anybody. Yet in the next couple of verses, he sends some spies to the city of Ai. And they come back pretty confident after their victory in Jericho and said, just a couple thousand. Just a couple thousand is, don't send all the troops over there. And verse 3 he said, only about 2,000 or 3,000 men need go up to Ai. Do not all the people toil up there, for they are few. And so they send those 3,000 men, and they lost very badly. And they're running back for their lives, and it says 36 of them were struck down in verse 5. 36 Israelites. Achan's actions cost 36 men their lives, as well as his own life and his family's eventually. And so we know what happens next. Joshua prays and said, What happened, Lord? Why did you bring us here that we might die? The Lord says, someone took something they shouldn't have. You guys didn't carry out my command entirely. Something was taken. And so the Lord, step by step, tribe by tribe, family by family, whittles it down and reveals Achan to be the culprit. And so they stone him, and they find the possessions in his tent, the things he stole from the city of Jericho. And it's just a reminder to us. God doesn't want us to tolerate evil in our lives. He didn't want them to leave any Canaanites in the land. He either wanted them to be killed or driven out. He didn't want any of them left to be a negative influence. And so when we come to God's plan for our victory spiritually, we need to drive out all the negative influences. Anything in our lives, anything in your life that is going to bring you down, that is going to pull you away from God, pull you away from your family, pull you in a direction that is contrary to God's plan, get rid of it. Destroy it. Don't have it in your life. Finish God and carry it out and stick with it. Very simple, very straightforward ideas this evening. But these are the kind of reminders that we need. How do we have victory in this life? How do we overcome sin? How do we overcome our enemy? How do we overcome temptation? We fall down at the right feet. We fall down at the feet of Jesus in humility. We cling to him and acknowledge he is our strength. We follow his plan, even when it goes counter to this world's intuition, even when it doesn't make sense to us. Sometimes we don't see how this is going to work for our benefit, but we follow the plan and we stick with it. Very simple instructions, but I hope you'll remember those as you go about your life. And if there's any way we can help you this evening, we want to offer an invitation, want to offer this as an opportunity. If you need prayers, need encouragement, if you need to have your sins washed away by being baptized in Jesus' name, we invite you to come forward as we stand and sing.